Um, Shannyn Bald is a PhD candidate in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at the University of Illinois at Urbana. Is it Champaign? Champaign?
Champagne, like the
Champaign,
drink.
thank you. I like the band. No, yeah. Her master's research was about the relationship between the church slash clergy and magician slash magical creatures in the lands of the Rus and Muscovy. Her current research looks at 21st century Russian historical fiction, particularly novels set in Rus and Muscovy. And the title of Shannyn's talk is The Division of Labor Between Magicians and the Church in Rus and Muscovy. So whenever you're ready, Shannyn, you're welcome to start.
Perfect. Thank you. Let me share. Okie dokie. And you can see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. Okay. So, as we know, the line between official Christian religion and pagan magic in medieval Europe was often quite blurry. Typically, however, it's believed that the church strictly condemned magic and its practitioners, while the lay people were more nonchalant about it. Magic was a large part of popular culture and folk belief that couldn't be entirely stamped out with the rise of Christianity, and there was certainly a melding of pre-Christian and Christian belief. The goal of this project, when I started it 4 years ago, or finished it 4 years ago, and it still is now, is to further blur the distinction between magic and religion in Rus and Muscovy, which lasted from roughly the 19th to 16th centuries in the area that's now Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. The Rus and the Muscovites present an interesting twist when considering the relationship between the church on the one hand and magicians and magical creatures on the other. This paper will be presenting the ways in which the medieval church in this area shared certain tasks with magicians because of a comprehension of their own abilities and the abilities of magical beings. It's evident that there existed an unusual division of labor, even a cooperation, between both groups when undertaking certain tasks, especially those concerning childbirth and weddings. In Rus and Muscovy, the clergy recognized that they were particularly powerless when it came to the dangers posed by demons, and so by relying on magicians, the former acknowledged the legitimacy of the latter and introduced a dynamic of trust and a syncretic melding of magic and religion that was already present at the lay level in the form of dvoevery, which I'll explain in a minute. So it's important, first of all, to recognize the place of religion in this society and its relationship to magic and magicians. Greek Orthodox Christianity was introduced to the Rus, and particularly to its ruling class, in 955, following the conversion of Olga, later Saint Olga of Kiev, following a trip to Constantinople. The transition to Christianity was made relatively quickly, with Grand Prince Vladimir the Great inquiring about various faiths in 986 and then converting himself and his people in 988. So there was merely a superficial layer of Christianity laid atop a rich pagan culture, which resulted in the blending of traditions known as dvoeveria, or dual belief. The concept of dvoeveria originated in the Middle Ages, and from its origin, the term was used in a negative sense. There are three statutes of significance regarding dvoeveria and magic: the individual statutes of Vladimir the Great and his son Yaroslav the Wise from the 11th century, and the Stoglov Church Council and subsequent decree overseen by Ivan IV in the 16th century. Seeing as Vladimir was viewed as the baptizer of the Rus, it was only natural for him to condemn the use of magic and place judgment in the hands of the church as a means of promoting Christian strength and legitimacy. The statute of Yaroslav is similar to that of his father's and discusses marital issues and the appropriate responses a man, and occasionally a woman, should take as a result of certain circumstances. In regard to magic, Yaroslav's statute is slightly more specific by targeting women who practice magic, stating that if a woman gets caught practicing magic by her husband, he should punish her but not separate from her, and the metropolitan is to be paid 6 hryvnias, which were like silver coins. This shows an interesting but unsurprising response to magic in Rus in the 11th century shortly after the conversion. These official statements on magic continued to be made throughout the Middle Ages to the 16th century and the reign of Ivan IV, the Terrible, as he's called. The consensus, however, was much stricter than it was in the 11th century. The statute of the Stoglov Church Council of 1551 features a Q&A between Ivan and the upper members of the clergy, covering a vast array of categories, including magic and the unending fight against dvoevery. The statute quotes John Chrysostom, saying, "If someone works sorcery or charms and says the name of the Holy Trinity and calls on the saints and makes the sign of the cross, run away. It's appropriate to turn from them." So, as expected, in response to Ivan's ponderings about magicians, the church responded with quotes from Byzantine theological discourse. A year later, in 52, Ivan issued a decree in which he condemned both the practitioners of magic and those who patronize them. He states that those who go to magicians forget both God and the Tsar and will thus fall into great disgrace and be placed in spiritual interdiction by the church hierarchs according to church rules. However, regardless of all attempts to ban it, as stipulated in these statutes, in Rus and Muscovy, Voevodia had a certain staying power. There are even instances of prayers, icons, saints, and other religious texts being employed in magic spells, and there were several types of spells that would overlap with the ability of prayers and blessings. William Ryan provides the following comprehensive list, all of these, of various spells, which were called Zegavori. The Zegavori covered a variety of positive topics, including healing, love, protection, and luck. But there were also spells that were not so good. Malefic magic, which was called Porcha in Rus and Muscovy. Porcha, which literally means spoil, could cause such negative effects as disorder in one's love life, crop failure, impotence, harm, death to one's rival, and hiccups. Malefic spells made by magicians could simply include poison used with a whispered or spoken spell, and other objects spoken over in the spell could include herbs, roots, graveyard earth, pieces of dead people, and candles made out of corpses. There's three categories of magician that I'll be discussing today. There were more, but we don't have the time for that, so we'll talk about three. The first is the Volk, which was an earlier type of magician seen both in Rus and in pre-Christian times. He was basically a village shaman, and he held social and political significance. They often led uprisings against the new state religion following the conversion. The next was the Koldun. They were very powerful magicians with questionable morality. You could pay them to do both good and bad things. And they also held a role in village life and in certain ceremonies. It was also believed that they could turn into vampires after death, so their death rituals were very specific and important. The last was the Znachar, literally the one who knows. They were folk healers and engaged in folk medicine and divination. It could perform or counteract evil magic. Each village in Rus and Muscovy claimed to have its own magician, who was a professional figure who provided services to the locals in the village, and this individual was often more important than the parish priest. In the year 1071, the major chronicle of the Rus, the Poviest Vremenichlet, or the PVL, tells the story of a magician in Novgorod, which at the time was the Principality of Gleb Vladimirovich. The story is as follows. A magician appeared one day and proceeded to harass the Novgorodians. The bishop ordered the people to choose either the cross or the magician. Gleb, as the son of Vladimir the Baptizer, chose the cross, rather obviously, as did his retainers. However, the common people all followed the magician, and thus there was great strife between them. This story is significant because it shows the attitude between the lay people and both their relatively new magician, or relatively new magic, no, relatively new religion, and magic. Although it had been nearly a century since Christianity was adopted, people still believed in and trusted magic and magicians, both of which have been present in their society long before Christianity. Based on the year that this occurred, the magician in question would have most likely been a Volk, which, as I mentioned, had political power. So because the Volk held such sway over the people, it's not surprising that they chose him over the cross. Despite the above tale, consulting magicians was not limited to a single stratum of class hierarchy. All level of societies believed in the usefulness of magicians. Another story from the PVL, from the year 912, states that Prince Oleg consulted magicians to foretell his death. The story goes that the magicians told Oleg that his favorite horse would be the death of him. So Oleg sent the horse away, and upon finding out later that it was dead, he mocked the magicians, went to the horse's resting place, and stomped on its skull. However, when he crushed the skull with his foot, a poisonous snake jumped out and bit him, and he died. Aside from the fact that this story exhibits the use of magicians by someone of the upper class, it's interesting in the fact that it's been included in a 12th century chronicle written by monks. In the way that it's written, the story is warning against dismissing prophecy, and it also legitimizes the magician's power. By including this story, the chronicle exposes the underlying understanding of a magician's power, that even if it is supplied by demons, it's indeed a power rather than a farce. So just as the line between the religious and the magical was blurry, so too was the line between clergyman or holy person and magician. For instance, someone might have prayed to a saint and also obtained a love potion for a happy marriage. Moreover, it may have been quite difficult for a layperson to differentiate between a clergyman or a saint providing aid and the aid provided by a magician. It's also important to note, recalling our discussion of Zegavori, that a lot of magical acts would have included Christian prayers and rituals. The existence of Dvoevria once again appears and blurs the line between religion and magic, particularly for lay people. So, as a common phenomenon in the Middle Ages, the clergy were willing to be lenient towards peasant belief in order to use it to help strengthen Christian ideas. Major life events such as birth, death, moving, and marriage made people especially vulnerable to magic. All of these times are seen as times of transition in one's life, and they correlate with such magical times as midnight, midsummer, midwinter, or magical places like the crossroads. So, the magic that I'll discuss now has a lot to do with these transitional periods in life that might require magical assistance. Although magicians and the clergy could perform much different tasks for those seeking aid, there were instances when these figures worked together, dividing jobs between clerical and magical authority. Weddings are the most interesting example of this division of labor, and there are two roles that the local magician could fill that the clergy could not. The first role was that of protector. Colduns could cause quite a lot of trouble at weddings, and it was possible to hire your Koldun as a guardian for a wedding or as a disturber of the peace. The 17th century physician of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich stated that seldom a wedding passes without some witchcraft, which alludes to just how prominent and common magic was at these events. For example, it was at weddings that people in the wedding party could be turned into werewolves by a hostile Koldun. However, there were quite strict requirements for this to happen, including having only 12 wedding guests and procuring a pea pod with only 12 peas. The second role, also involving weddings, was the overseeing of the bride's bath. In Rus and Muscovy, the bathhouse was considered an incredibly dangerous place. Many people engaged in magic in the bathhouse, especially at midnight. This included summoning demons and performing rituals meant to turn oneself into a koldun. It was, in a way, seen as a form of spiritual housing for the magicians who would go to the bathhouse when others went to the church. When entering the bathhouse, rather obviously, the bather needed to remove anything that they didn't want to get wet. This included removing any religious or protective items like a belt, a cross, a talisman. And by removing these items, the average person was removing any chance that they had to protect against evil. Additionally, any clergy entering the bathhouse would have had to remove the holy objects that provided protection for them against demons. But this wasn't the case with the koldun. By employing a koldun to supervise this ritual, it effectively meant ensuring the bride's safety against any evil spirits who might try to harm her. In this way, the church would have had to begrudgingly allow the magician's participation or risk a possessed or dead bride. The next overlap between the clergy and magicians had to do with childbirth. Although it was an event that inspired spiritual significance, the vulnerability of both the mother and the child required magical intervention. While one could certainly pray for a healthy baby and a safe birth, Christianity lacks childbirth rituals due to the fact that one isn't born a Christian but must first be baptized, and the woman was seen as being impure, so the rituals surrounding childbirth trended towards the magical. Additionally, childbirth was a strictly female event. Men were not allowed to participate, and this included the priest. So the znacharka, the feminine of the znachar, she could also be the village midwife, and wet nurse was an important participant. The midwife performed folk medicine and would have had experience with spells and potions for the purposes of childbirth. The znacharka also purified the mother and the baby with various herbs and rituals. Orthodox churchmen were suspicious of such purification rituals because of their connection to paganism. However, they recognized it as important, and there were no specific condemnations against the use of herbs in purification after childbirth. Therefore, there was a necessity for the involvement of a magician as a protector of these women and children involved in the birth. And considering the all-female environment that the birth would take place in, there was a need for magicians to ensure that all went smoothly. Healing was another job that saw an overlap with magic and religion. Yet, although the perception of magic is quite negative, there remains the fact that there were two main overarching explanations for ailments in Rus and Muscovy: the biological, viewed as the rational or logical explanation, and the magical. The logical explanation for ailments included such factors as injury, lack of nutrients, and an imbalance of one's humors. On the other hand, the magical explanation included the evil eye, portia, and possession. Additionally, there was a belief that a magical malady could only be cured through magical means. So there was a line that magicians trod in their work and that they'd be tolerated so long as they weren't causing anybody harm. If a person took their sick child to a magician and the child was healed, great, no problem. But if the sick child subsequently died after a visit to the magician, that was when there was a problem. They were more likely to be accused and tried after that. This willingness to look the other way, so long as the outcome was favorable, emphasizes the way in which magicians were integrated into the workings of society. Magicians were able to discern the magically induced ailment and its cause, often the work of another magician. This put them at a unique advantage over the clergy in being able to solve magical illnesses. So, much like the understanding that existed in the bathhouse between a magician and the church, there was a similar understanding of the limits imposed on the clergy to be able to deal with problems of this nature. Interestingly, many incantations used for healing begin with an ecclesiastical formula or prayer, and some include Christian figures to be a blend of the ecclesiastical and the magical. Therefore, dvoeveria and the division of labor between magicians and religious authorities becomes apparent in the field of medicine because there existed a division between types of illnesses that required magical intercession and those that did not. When the issue was seen as having magical causes, consulting a priest was not seen as the primary course of action, but rather a magician was believed to be more suited in that particular scenario. Magicians and magic in Rus and Muscovy may thus be seen to fit into society in a way that both clashes and intertwines with religion and the ecclesiastical authorities. There existed an unusual division of labor and cooperation between the church and magicians when undertaking certain tasks pertaining to childbirth, healing, and weddings. The clergy recognized that there were certain instances in which they were essentially powerless when it came to the dangers posed by demons. So, by relying in these instances on magicians, the clergy introduced a dynamic of trust and a syncretic melding of magic and religion that was already seen at the lay level in the form of dvoeveria. Typically, when considering holy and unholy individuals, it's believed that the holy are performing acts that are beneficial and good, while the unholy are performing acts that are malicious. However, this isn't always the case. As I've hopefully demonstrated, magicians in Rus and Muscovy served a variety of roles that, while not always good, were not always solely evil. This can be seen in their function as protectors, healers, and midwives. This meant that magicians provided services to lay people that were not filled or not filled completely by the clergy and other holy individuals. As I said at the beginning, the line between religion and magic is foggy at the very best. And the aim of this project was not to make clearer the differentiation between the two, but rather to further blur this line. In Rus and Muscovy, a need existed for the continued reliance on magic by both lay people and clergymen alike. By trying to separate the two, I would go so far as to say that one limits the possibility of truly understanding the society and its people. Even the PVL, recorded by monks, admits the impressiveness of magic, saying, "It's remarkable what may be accomplished through witchcraft and enchantment." Thank you for listening.